was a rather promising statement. I think over the last few years they've been concerned about this and have sought to diversify their sources of imports. They now import 60% of their oil. And they've been looking around the world to places where they could not be so dependent on Saudi Arabia. And of course, when the Soviets fell, the opportunity arose to look at the Caspian. And the Caspian is one of the world's oldest oil provinces, being already developed in the 1840s. But so far, of course, all the work had been done onshore, and the Soviets had no particular reason to invest in offshore technology. So the offshore, this large area offshore, was open in a very attractive geological setting. And the Western companies rushed in there, feeling that at last here was a new frontier that they could conquer. And not only the companies started thinking about this, but seems very little doubt that these various think tanks and geopolitical strategists and these whole raft of people started thinking about here was a great supply of oil that the West and particularly America could tap, and it was located in this very unfortunate place in a landlocked condition surrounded by newly independent and not very reliable countries through which the export pipelines had to go. Now the natural way to take the Caspian oil out would be through Iran to the Persian Gulf, but that was considered unsuitable because Iran was perceived to be an enemy, and you'd simply transfer the control not only of Iranian oil but Caspian oil too to the Iranians. So that was rejected. And then there was a kind of, not very evident, but apparently it's been going on, there was a kind of military involvement. Military missions were sent to Uzbekistan and to Azerbaijan and to Kazakhstan, and bases were established and aid and weapons were delivered, and who exactly knows what all that really was, but at least it was a growing wish to control Central Asia in some manner or another. And then we had a statement by, I think, Al-Chalabi was the first to actually put a number to it. And I don't have the exact reference, but the image of this possibly having 200 billion barrels of oil was put out, and this was rapidly taken up by the media, and before we knew what had happened, it had become a matter of fact, so that all this geopolitical strategies and the military planning and the pipeline routes and all this huge thinking and working away was all premised on the 200 billion barrels that it was now assumed was there for the taking. But then we began slowly over the last 10 years to get the actual results of exploration, and here I might digress a little bit to explain the geology, because eventually it's geology that matters. Well, the extreme south of the Caspian is a deep, deep basin in front of the mountains of the Carpathian Himalayan belt, so there's deep in front of it, and by virtue of being deep you would expect gas. This is a gas province. Sure enough, BP drilled on the edge of this thing a field called Chardonnay, and it's a nice big gas field with some gas liquids associated with it, just as you would expect. Then you go to Baku in Azerbaijan, which is the ancient oil capital of this region, and this lies on the proto-delta of the Volga River. So this is a narrow belt running across the Caspian from Azerbaijan into Turkmenistan, and it contains, as it well known for 100 years, quite thick, shallow reservoirs filled with oil leaking up through the tertiary sediments. And the Soviets had already identified a large structure just offshore, and with rather primitive platforms more or less coming off the beach, they had begun to develop this thing. While the Western companies have gone in there, and they have now produced, they are now producing this field, and it's got, I don't know, 3 to 5 billion barrels of oil in it. A nice oil field, but nothing outrageous. And this trend goes on eastwards, but it looks as if it gets gassy in that direction because it gets deeper. So this is a narrow belt, it's fairly well understood, and there's more to come out of it, but nothing outrageous. Then let's turn to the northern end of the Caspian, where in 1979 onshore, the Soviets did find field called Tengiz, a very deep field, 4,500 meters deep. The reservoir is a reefal deposit, and the source is a deep Silurian source. The critical thing here is there's a cap of salt, thick salt that holds it all in. Salt is a very good seal. And so, but the one unfortunate feature of this oil, it has 16% sulfur. It's a very sulfurous oil. And the Soviet steel just wasn't up to coping with this high sulfur that corrodes the pipes and everything. So anyway, Chevron then came in and is producing this field with difficulty. They've got production up to 250,000 barrels a day. And just recently they've announced that their hopes of expanding this to 700 are delayed or deferred or not happening. And they've had some conflict with the Kazakh government over the environmental consequence of these huge tips of sulfur that they extract from the oil. Then offshore, this is the real critical thing, offshore is an enormous structure, an enormous thing, very similar in general appearance to this Tengiz field. And at first sight, this was indeed, looked like promising to be the world's largest oil field, something outrageously large. But, and it's in shallow water, there are environmental problems because it's the breeding ground of the sturgeon, which the Russians like for caviar. There's some gruesome wind there that covers everything in ice in winter. It's difficult to get the equipment in because it's shallow water. But eventually, and having spent $300 million, they managed to sink the first well. And again, it was deep, again, it was high sulfur, and it was in the order of 6 to 8 billion barrels. And now they had more knowledge of what the reservoir was, and it became evident that this was a reef and that this whole structure was a platform within which were isolated reefs. And then they drilled another one to the west, and together it seems that the reserves of this place is in the order of 9 to 13 billion. And the economics of it are desperate. You've environmental problems, you've uncertainty about the pipeline routes, you've uncertainty about the contract. Everything is difficult about it. And eventually BP and Statoil withdrew from the project. Now, when you find a major oil company withdrawing from 9 to 13 billion barrels of oil, it tells you there's something pretty seriously wrong with it. And there are a few more prospects left to test around, but I think the conclusion is that this is still nice oil fields there, it's still a nice province in a normal sense, but it isn't going to change the world position. Now, stepping back just a little bit, it does have a lot of gas, mind you. And one of these pipeline routes that were planned was through Afghanistan to supply gas to Pakistan and India. And the famous Enron company was involved in all of that. And this man, Katabi, whatever his name is, the new president of Afghanistan, Karzai, he was formerly involved in this Union Oil project in some consultancy fashion and so on. Anyway, then we had 9/11, as they call it, or the Twin Towers, and suddenly the Bush administration felt obliged to react in some way to these alleged terrorists who were responsible for this, who surprisingly enough were apparently living in an Afghan cave. And so the next thing we hear is this Afghan war broke loose, and one can see maybe it was about trying to find these terrorist people and the man in the cave and everything, but it had also a sort of hidden agenda of a convenient place to establish a presence on the edge of the Caspian Sea with all of this oil that was supposed to be there. It may not be that there was an actual pipeline through Afghanistan, may not have been quite what was planned because this was primarily a gas project, but still it was a presence and a point from which US control could be exercised over this situation. Well, all of this went by, and gradually, and I don't think there was any particular moment of revelation, but gradually the news began to filter out. And by the way, ExxonMobil also withdrew from Azerbaijan. That, again, when you find the major companies pulling out, it delivers a sort of message. I think gradually the penny began to drop that, well, the Caspian wasn't really going to make all this much difference. And then, surprisingly, we suddenly find the Afghan campaign comes to a sort of inconclusive end. They toppled the government, but what really else happened? They never found the man they were looking for.